Welcome to this DRI webinar, Resilience in the Digital Era, Navigating BCM in the Wake of Rapid Digital Transformation. The COVID-19 pandemic brought about rapid change for businesses and industries in every corner of the world who were forced to implement years of planned digital solutions in a matter of just weeks or months. The unexpected need to transition large numbers of employees to a work-from-home model required a major rethink to business and IT service delivery models, where risks quickly transitioned from premises and office environments to data centres, networks, software applications, and data and cyber security. In this webinar, I'm going to discuss how this digital transformation has impacted business continuity planning and how its BCM is evolving to keep pace with this emerging digital era. I'm Rod Crowder. I'm the country representative of DRI here in Australia and New Zealand. I'm also the founder and managing director of a consultancy business called OpCenter, which specialises in BCP, risk resilience, disaster recovery and cyber and information security consulting. And we have around 140 or 50 clients and now over 450 client projects since we started out in business 24 or 25 years ago. I'm a reasonably frequent speaker at international and local business continuity events such as Disaster Recovery Institute, Continuity Insights, Continuity Forum and local industry events. I have a bachelor's degree in computer science from the University of Brighton in the UK. So I do bring a level of technical expertise to this presentation. And I live in Sydney, Australia after emigrating from the UK here in 1989. The agenda for this webinar is I'd like to give a little bit of history of business continuity management, where it's come from, just so everyone's aware of its evolution. I'd like to talk about COVID-19 pandemic and its impacts on BCM, what were some of the key learnings, and how COVID-19 impacted traditional business continuity management, what was learnt. And then I'd like to talk about some of the post-pandemic BCM methodologies and how they are changing and evolving to deal with the new normal, as it's called, that we now find ourselves in. And in terms of BCM standards, frameworks and guidelines, I'll just include this slide for those of you who may be new to the journey. It's worthwhile understanding just a little bit about where these standards some of these standards and where they've evolved from. BS 25999 evolved into ISO 22301, which is now the international standard for business continuity management. There are then specific guidelines like by the likes of the SEC, NIST, FEMA, Australian standards, etc. There are, of course, guidelines and professional practices such as DRI's 10 professional practices. And then there are a range of adaptive and agile BCM standards, which have sort of been coming to the fore over the last few years, looking at slightly different approaches, more contemporary approaches to business continuity management. And then there are industry-specific regulations and compliance, and I won't go into all of these, but depending on which industry you're in, retail, food and beverage, telecommunications, financial sector, these generally vary by country. So if you're in the banking sector in Australia, we have what we call APRA. The pharmaceutical industry has similar standards and regulatory requirements, local government sector, and so on. So a whole range of different standards and frameworks and guidelines. Worthwhile just understanding what they are before you set out on a business continuity management program. Just understanding, what applies to your organisation within your country, what standard you're going to adopt, and what compliance obligations you might have. So what were some of the impacts that COVID-19 had on business continuity management? Obviously, COVID-19 was a global crisis, not just impacting health of humanity and healthcare providers and the healthcare system, but also economies, supply chains, telecommunication, border closures, and so on. So it was effectively numerous different business continuity events or crisis events all running in parallel. And it therefore challenged the existing paradigm of business continuity management. Most business continuity plans are probably structured around one or two events occurring, generally sort of singular events. And of course, organisations which had an existing plan that was based around an event suddenly found that they had 5 or 6 events to deal with. So a lot of the existing planning was ineffective. What we also found was that a lot of organisations had no planning whatsoever. So of course, those with no plan were faced with the need to actually develop business continuity management tactics for all corners of their organisation. So considerable impacts across all areas of the globe and all industries. And in terms of just some of the top categories of types of impacts that occurred, obviously there was the immediate disruption in the response. So organisations in March 2020 suddenly found themselves faced with workplace closures, travel restrictions on staff, forced shutdowns of buildings and premises and so on. That the massive increasing technology demands to deploy equipment and software and so on to their employees, and they need to work remotely, and the big need for crisis communications, which again a lot of organisations had never really had to deal with on the scale that they had to in response to COVID-19. Supply chain vulnerabilities were massively exposed, factory closures, transport issues, border closures, fluctuating demands for products. So some organisations were unable to manufacture because their facilities were closed. So there was a less demand for raw products and materials and so on. Then others were trying to increase the demand, particularly in the healthcare sector. So where the healthcare industry needed to sort of, get parts and equipment and medical devices cross borders and so on. Obviously, that was all impacted as well. So remote work and digital transformation was obviously one of the biggest things that came out of the COVID-19 pandemic, with the massive shift to cloud and as a service hosting, migration and of legacy applications to enable sort of all parts of the organisation to continue using some of those applications. Huge amount of focus on cybersecurity, and I'll talk a little bit more detail about that later on. And obviously sort of gearing up for remote access. Most organisations had some level of remote access and cloud hosting and so on prior to COVID. COVID-19 was really a catalyst to accelerate all of that. And of course, a lot of aspects were tested of technology were tested in terms of just the capacity and the bandwidth and the performance. Whilst it might have been common for you to have 10 or 20% of your organisation working remotely or working from anywhere prior to COVID, obviously all of a sudden 100% of the organisations were working remotely, and so it really did stress test a lot of those technology capabilities. Of course, there are economic impacts as well, so there were massive financial impacts around the world. There were whole industries, some of which were winners out of COVID, and some organisations which pivoted, were very strategic and managed to pivot and actually take advantage of the situation, find new products and services and new ways of working, and come to market in a different way. Of course, if you're in the hospitality industry, a lot of those organisations didn't survive. Your local takeaway and your local restaurants and so on obviously had to, turn to basically a takeaway only type organisation place. So there was a lot of winners and losers, and there were just so many different crises going on concurrently in different parts of the world, which organisations had to deal with. And then, of course, underpinning all this were all the health and safety issues around vaccination, workplace safety and distancing, and PPE, personal protective equipment, flexibility of workplaces. As the pandemic continued, organisations started to rotate teams through the organisation's premises and have some teams working from home, some remotely, and so on. So a whole series of different individual impacts which were felt. So in terms of impacts on business continuity specifically, and in terms of the effectiveness of existing BCM plans, I've put 6 categories here. There are probably 16 or maybe 60 in total. But in the space of the webinar today, I just want to focus on these 6. Leadership and culture, in terms of how well organisations from a leadership perspective and across the organisation, the understanding of BCM and so on, and how well business continuity frameworks and plans were led and responses were led. Risk management, in terms of the effectiveness of existing risk management programs, how they fared in terms of business continuity management. Resourcing, in terms of people and staffing and resources required to respond to the pandemic. Plans, in terms of the actual physical documents themselves, the formats, the effectiveness of them, and so on. Communications, in terms of how well organisations communicated across what some of the challenges were from a communications perspective. And then obviously technology and cybersecurity and the impacts around business continuity management on those. So I'm just going to look at each of these 6 categories briefly, and then we'll talk about the way forward in terms of what the learnings were and how this is all embedded in business continuity management frameworks going forwards. So from a leadership and culture perspective, some interesting observations around how BCM, how effective it was, and some of the challenges around business continuity management. First of all was the lack of oversight and leadership from an executive perspective. I think that's probably because A lot of executive teams delegate business continuity management to operational areas of the business, so business unit or divisional levels. And so in the past, never really been that exposed across this, a bit of a generalisation, but in some organisations hadn't really been exposed to business continuity management. And of course, now the executive teams are faced with, looking at workplace closures, border closures, technology upgrades, work from home strategies, dealing with the health and well-being of their staff and so on. So I think one of the things is, the importance and of ownership and executive ownership and of business continuity management and involvement in those programs as they're rolled out. Obviously, one of the big shifts, as I mentioned previously, was digitisation. And so organisations suddenly realised the value, and whilst a lot of organisations had roadmaps out for several years, which they accelerated, I think one CIO in the UK said we've implemented 7 years worth of digital transformation in a matter of about 7 weeks. And a lot of organisations out of that actually realised the value in digitisation, that, if they'd done this years beforehand or years ago, they'd actually realise a lot more benefits to their business. So being forced to digitise so quickly and digitally transform so quickly actually was seen as a big benefit for a lot of organisations. Operations often weren't prepared for this polycrisis, these multiple different events all going on at the same time. So managing all these different aspects. Most BCM plans were, again, as I mentioned previously, developed sort of with a single event in mind. So just being able to manage all those different crises at the same time. And of course, organisations needed to very quickly implement tactical and informal strategies and so on that weren't documented. So for things which hadn't been thought about previously, in terms of maybe hadn't been assessed, maybe strategies hadn't been developed, plans hadn't been written, they hadn't tested this kind of a scenario before, then obviously they needed to implement things very quickly on the fly to maintain continuity of operations. And then one of the really big findings was that there was limited organisational BCM awareness. And what I mean by that is that lots of the pandemic affected basically every corner of every organisation. Everybody was impacted in some way, shape or form. Previously, with business continuity, development of plans and strategies and undertaking business impact assessments and so on, it had only really been done by a small subset or small corner of the organisation. Not every area of the business had been involved in a business impact assessment. Not every area of the business was aware that a business continuity framework was in place, what was expected of them in a business continuity event, and so on. And suddenly, people were being asked to work from home, work in a different way, use different tools, etc., socially distance, etc., etc. So the importance of increasing training and awareness and involvement in exercising and so on across the entire organisation really came to the fore, and that was a really big learning out of how effective business continuity programs were. That every part of the organisation needs to be trained, and every part of the organisation needs to be involved in different aspects of exercising. The other key thing, just on the learnings, were how messaging needs to be improved. I've got a specific slide about communications, but specifically around messaging to all staff internally and externally, how important that is from a leadership perspective, making sure that people were giving consistent messaging and so on across the duration of the pandemic. Again, purely and because it was such a long duration compared to most types of business continuity events. So from a risk management perspective, organisations often found that the risk registers were out of date, that they hadn't been actively maintained, that current risks hadn't been adequately assessed. Risk ratings may well have changed over time, and therefore that there were risks which they were now being faced with, risks that had eventuated that hadn't previously been considered by the organisation. Either that or they hadn't been reassessed, so the current risk levels weren't well understood or hadn't been kept up to date. And that a lot of the risks they were facing hadn't been documented at all or even considered by the organisation. I think one of the biggest learnings was around the risks around supply chain and third parties. So for organisations which require raw goods, materials, etc., one of the big learnings was that organisations suddenly realised how critical those organisations were to them and the knock-on impact on their own business continuity by not being able to access logistics, fleet providers, transport companies, get goods and services in and out of, or goods in and out of the country, for example, raw materials, whatever it might be. And again, those risks had never really been assessed previously. And then similarly with suppliers, so for example, IT companies, legal companies, marketing companies, even if they're providing a service rather than a physical good, there was a lot of assumptions around what those providers would be able to provide in a disaster or a crisis scenario. And of course, in the pandemic, those companies were also impacted, so weren't necessarily able to continue to provide products and services to the expectation of their clients. So the need to understand the risks in critical third parties and supply chains was certainly highlighted as something that needed a lot of improvement. Risk ownership and mitigation plans were also found to have not been to be found to be not well managed, and by that I mean that there may have been current risks and impacts, likelihoods, etc., assessed at a point in time. There was a target or a residual risk that had been identified over, say, a 3-month period or a 6-month period, and that was owned by somebody in the organisation to basically deal with that risk mitigation or that risk, taking it from the current risk to the desired risk. And that hadn't happened. So there were a lot of risks which were remained on risk registers which just hadn't been dealt with, hadn't been mitigated. So they weren't well managed. And of course, because of the duration of the pandemic as well, risk acceptance levels changed from the start to the end. And in BCM, generally looking at relatively short, sharp operational impacts, because the pandemic ran for sort of 2+ years. Fundamentally, risk appetites changed, and particularly as organisations pivoted and changed their product and service mix and how they ran their businesses, then the risk acceptance levels changed between the start of the pandemic and the end of the pandemic. So some of the strategies around that, obviously, enterprise risk management needs to encompass all the different types of risk, and the risk registers need to be maintained. Risk management processes need to be enforced and so on. And if you've got critical suppliers and third parties, it's worthwhile sitting down with those organisations and understanding what their risk framework is, what their business continuity plan is, where your organisation might well sit in the pecking order if there's to be some sort of event like this, whether it's a pandemic or if it's just any other type of outage or any other type of business disruption that those businesses may well have. What's their business continuity strategy? What standards is it built around? Has it been tested? When was it last tested, maintained, etc.? At least then, with that understanding, your organisation can get a good feel for what's in place and what isn't, and then you can develop strategies for that. So, some really interesting learnings from a risk management perspective. From a BCM resourcing perspective, plans didn't adequately address key person risks. I think the risks have been identified, but the plans didn't address them. And what I mean by that is, as part of the business impact assessment stage of a business continuity program, you obviously look at key person dependencies, particular skills, particular racial relationships with different parts of government or with suppliers or with customers, whatever it might be. And whilst you may well identify those, I think what was lacking in a lot of business continuity plans was, what were the actual mitigation strategies for that? Do we need to cross-train people? Do we need to look at potentially outsourcing that function if that particular person or that team is incapacitated? Should we document critical functions and processes in more detail and so on? So whilst the risk may well have been assessed, the mitigation strategies weren't well understood or documented. Again, unless you had a specific pandemic plan, a lot of BC plans didn't really address the loss or unavailability of large numbers of people at the same time. So with some of our clients, for example, we have plans which, if we had X% of the workforce impacted, 10%, 20%, 30%, 40%, effectively build a matrix and sort of say each different level of impact on our staff, what functions and processes are we going to be able to maintain, which might need to be outsourced in that situation or which might need to stop altogether. So a lot of business continuity plans didn't include that kind of information, hadn't really looked at wholesale impacts to large numbers of people, locations or teams. And so organisations were then scrambling to determine what their business continuity strategies were. There's a lot of assumed capability outside the organisation. So, for example, you have an IT service provider that provides hosting services and IT services, and suddenly you want to ramp up your remote working capability by X number of hundreds of percent. So you might have 100 people with remote access and you want to make that available to 1,000 people. And organisations contacted their IT MSPs, and of course every other organisation was doing the same thing. So that IT provider may or may not been able to provide the service. So there was a lot of assumptions made around what those services would be without them really being formalised or having had the conversation. And of course, with the pandemic, there are a lot of issues around well-being, morale, productivity, engagement. People that have the water cooler conversations in the office, or they go and have for coffee meetings and just interacting on a day-to-day basis. This really sort of overlaps with sort of probably more HR issues as much as BCM issues, but just understanding what those broader range of employee assistance programs are, how you maintain morale, productivity, and so on. That was quite key. Just back on that issue of third parties, it's worthwhile having a conversation. If you tier your vendors, you might sort of have a 4-tier model where the top tier of vendors or suppliers, third parties, are absolutely critical to your organisation. The business process or function stop if they stop. Tier 2, 3, 4, where 4 are probably occasional use type vendors. Certainly for those top 1 or 2 tiers, worthwhile having conversations with those vendors about what their strategies are and what can be expected, and perhaps formalising that in a contract or in a memorandum of understanding at least, so that there's an expectation there that if you ever do experience a major disruption, such as was COVID, that you actually have agreements in place with those organisations to continue to provide services. I guess the other key aspect of resourcing was making sure that all people across the organisation were trained in the business continuity program, and if they were going to be expected to take over roles or functions or processes from other areas of the business, what is the expectation? What documentation do they need? What training do they need, and so on. One of the key deliverables from a business continuity management project is the plan, of course, or the plans, and you may have one or more. You may have just one business continuity plan. Some organisations also have emergency management plans and crisis management plans and a whole range of disaster recovery plans. Some of the large banks have hundreds of individual disaster recovery plans for key applications or location-based and so on. I think one of the key learnings out of COVID is that lengthy and complex plans were of little use or value. What plans really needed to be were guidance, aid memoirs, quick reference guides, summary handbooks, to give people the key information that they needed to respond to the evolving crisis. Just not human nature to sit down with a 166-page document and sort of turn to page 35 to look for the flow chart and then what are all the key steps and so on when you're faced with a crisis. And most executives are not going to use a document like that. And that was certainly one of the key learnings, that there's a need for much more agile and succinct levels of types of plans across the organisations. From a compliance perspective, you may well need to still develop a more lengthy plan for compliance and regulatory reasons, but in terms of usability, an A3 or an A4 quick reference guide or a 5-10 page handbook seems to be felt as a far more effective type of document. Plans are often out of date. Organisations may well have developed continuity plans at a point in time for an audit requirement or a specific customer requirement, or because they saw it a good thing to do at the time. But often they were out of date, so they weren't current. So business structures had changed, systems had changed, teams had changed, resources, third parties, etc., hadn't been maintained, and so on. So the plans are out of date and therefore, not really very helpful. And the other thing is that often staff didn't know where to find the plans. So whilst there might have been a core project team developing and designing the plans and rolling them out, that hadn't been well communicated across the organisation. So plans were hard to find. Staff with a role in the plan hadn't necessarily been trained, so it's very important to make sure that those people are actually trained in the roles, particularly if they're a member of a continuity response team. They need to be trained in what they need to be doing, what's expected of them. And of course, because again of the long-term nature of COVID as opposed to general BC plans, which probably generally look at sort of incidents which occur for a matter of a day or two up to about 30 days, because the plans, the COVID-19 pandemic extended to a 2+ year period. A lot of the plans didn't actually consider some of those, what might originally be less important functions and processes that maybe would needed to be undertaken on a quarterly or a semi-annual basis, suddenly they became quite important given the duration of the pandemic. So certainly a need to make sure that plans are regularly reviewed and updated and tested, making sure that key information is captured in all the plans, that they're readily accessible, that they're usable and practical, that they're socialised across the organisation, that people know what their role is, and of course making sure that as you build maturity, of course you're always going to start with the most critical functions and processes that impact your reputation, finance, productivity, legislation, compliance. Every plan's going to sort of look at those in the first instance. But as you build maturity into your program, considering what some of those longer term business continuity planning strategies need to be. A solid communication strategy is very important for any business continuity framework, and that being the mechanisms and the tools and the process and responsibilities by which you communicate with your staff and your teams and all of your different locations, and internal stakeholders, but also external stakeholders like customers, regulators, healthcare professionals, etc. A lot of organisations found there's a lot of misinformation, and social media probably adds fuel to that fire these days. Whereby there's a lot of information that's shared around the organisation that doesn't come from official sources and so on, both internal and external. And of course, because there were so many different types of crises running in parallel, as I mentioned before, a polycrisis, for want of a better word, organisations were challenged to work out who was responsible for communicating and which of the different channels were being used. So digital communications tools needed to be deployed very, very quickly. And there were a lot of benefits from deploying things like Teams and Zoom and Slack and all these different types of collaboration tools. But the overall task of communicating and the amount of resource required was vastly underestimated by a number of organisations. So it's therefore really important to actually have a solid communications plan in place. I know a lot of clients that we've worked with since the pandemic have said that one of the key areas they wanted to focus on in terms of a business continuity uplift was not around the processes and the strategies, but actually around the communications itself. So making that much more rigorous and defining the roles, the responsibilities, the tools, the frequency, and so on. That also needs to be tested in terms of making sure that the communication strategies are actually tested and the tools are tested, and it needs to be actively maintained and make sure that communications list, and it's always a bit of an arduous task, but obviously communications lists and so on, and contact details, contact information, particularly for things like critical customers and so on, need to be actively maintained. And of course, technology and cybersecurity were one of the heaviest hit areas as a result of the pandemic, again, because of the need to digitally transform so quickly and so unexpectedly. And that was often at the complete odds with what the organisation was trying to do from a financial perspective. So because of the downturn in markets and economies and supply chains and the demand for products and services across certain industries, businesses were trying to save a lot of money. So they were trying to reduce spending. And of course, IT departments and technology departments were looking to ramp up and increase many times fold their normal IT security spend to enable the organisation to digitally transform. So there was a lot of conflict there in terms of the amount of IT expenditure required. From a cybersecurity perspective, whilst I'm not suggesting that cybersecurity was an afterthought by any organisation, but a lot of the rigour and a lot of the normal processes didn't get upheld necessarily during the deployment of the new digital environments. And so the cyber activists, as we've seen over the last few years, the hacking and the cyber incidents increased dramatically just because organisations had to deploy technology infrastructure so quickly, and again weren't able to necessarily put in all of those very rigorous controls and so on. So organisations, some of them are still been looking at some of those, increasing and improving those cybersecurity controls as a post-pandemic. Capacity was also tested, and capacity of data centres, of applications, licensing models, network bandwidth connectivity, voice connectivity, and so on. Mobile networks, etc. From a previous perspective, most organisations prior to COVID had some level of remote working capability for a percentage or a subset of their employees, but if suddenly they were taking 100% of their employees and putting them all online, and obviously that stress tested a lot of the performance around technology and communications. In terms of some of the key learnings around technology, IT strategies and technology operating models needed to be looked at. Cybersecurity architectures and zero trust architectures and so on, and controls needed to be rigorously reevaluated and new technologies deployed. And there was a need to look at sort of, what the continuity plans and the recovery plans were across things like cyber incident response and disaster recovery, and of course business continuity. And data and information did become and is increasingly becoming way more important for organisations. We're now creating a lot more information on an online sense, digital sense, and so the value of that information, what's sensitive, what's private, what's confidential, and so on, where it's stored, how is it stored. It's very important for organisations to assess that as part of the business impact assessment. Most BAs would look at the recovery time objective, the RTO, and the RPO, the recovery point objective, when data needs to be restored and so on. But really now, post-COVID, there needs to be another level of analysis around data and information to make sure that the backup and business continuity strategies around data and information are upheld. And I think what we're seeing is, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in a moment, but just in terms of we're seeing disaster recovery, business continuity, and cyber incident response really evolving into a sort of whole cyber resilience framework now. So what if our defences fail? It's not about sort of saying we don't have a cyber incident response plan or a disaster recovery plan. A lot of those things are maybe well be in place, but if they're not effective, then we still need a plan to deal with cyber resilience, i.e. from a business perspective, how we're going to operate our business without the relevant data and information systems that we would normally have access to. So what does all this mean for the evolution of BCM in this new digital era? From a threat and risk perspective, there's a much greater need to look at the technology aspects in a lot more detail. I did previously talk about supply chains and third parties. That was certainly one of the key areas of threat and risk, which needs to be more closely looked at in terms of those third parties that you're dealing with, as I talked about earlier. But there's a whole range of aspects of IT and technology which also need to be much more thoroughly assessed. People are now working from home using domestic grade internet connections. The security across those is obviously very different to a corporate network, which is deployed and managed centrally by an organisation. And of course, people are now relying on their own internet connection from home, often their own device, BYOD, and so on. So communications networks, the posture has changed dramatically, and organisations certainly need to look at the risks and the threats to those networks and how they're secured. I mentioned previously about data and information from a business impact perspective. Data and information needs much more in-depth analysis in terms of looking at, where are our crown jewels, who has access to them, do we need a zero trust architecture implemented to make sure that only the right people from a role-based access control mechanism, the right people have access to or the relevant people have access to the data and information, and again, how are we securing it, and how are we making sure that it's protected. There's a lot of blind faith in cloud and as a service hosting models. It's Microsoft, it's Amazon, it's Google, it's et cetera. Those organizations from a hosting perspective generally provide you with a vanilla solution for the base price, and you can procure all of these additional services around security and backup and disaster recovery and multiple availability zones and so on, but at a cost. They don't come out of the box. And that's been a bit of a fallacy with a lot of organisations that haven't really understood that those things aren't baked into the core solution. They're available, but they do need to be specified and purchased as an additional item to just the standard, cloud hosting service or managed service and so on. So organisations need to look at some of those threats and risks and understand what their disaster recovery requirements are, and make sure that the appropriate levels of contingency, backup, security, and so on are procured as part of those as a service hosting. Backup and archiving strategies need to change dramatically, particularly with the advent of cyber crime and cyber events. A lot of organisations, if they used to have IT failures, you'd go back to yesterday's backup. And of course, nowadays, we know that ransomware and malware may well have been sitting in environments for weeks or months before it's actually detected. So if you have a ransomware attack or a cyber attack today, it just doesn't mean you can go back to yesterday's backup. Often organisations have to go back many, many months to the last clean or last known good backup. And of course, the evolution of what we call immutable backups, i.e. those which cannot be changed in any way, shape or form. There are vendors now which provide technologies around immutable backups to make sure that they are fully protected and always available if you need to restore from them if you've had some sort of cyber breach. Digital tools and solutions certainly need to play a bigger part in the overall business continuity life cycle. My view is that business continuity management is as much about preparedness as it is about having a plan in place to deal with a specific event or a number of events. And what I mean by that is that BCP, what we often see with the business continuity plans is that they are defined around how we respond to a specific event, whether that's a flood or a fire or an impact on our resources from an IT perspective, people perspective, premises perspective, and so on. And I think there's always going to be a place for continuity plans that have that kind of flavour. But they're really business recovery plans, not business continuity plans. And I think business continuity needs to evolve so that we're looking at the preparedness in terms of what are the tools and technologies we can put in place prior to an incident occurring to ensure that we minimise the potential for it or its impact or its likelihood as far as possible. So obviously there are a lot of technology areas that we can look into, things like cloud and hosting. Obviously organisations have had to move a lot of workloads out to cloud and as a service and managed hosting providers. There's artificial intelligence is now becoming very prevalent in business continuity management. So artificial intelligence as it applies to things like threat intelligence and modelling, plan development, testing and training. So you can use AI now in a whole range of different ways. And there are a lot of different vendors which are now in the marketplace offering AI-based solutions to support the BCM lifecycle with AI and machine learning tools and business process automation. So automating the standard repetitive tasks with bots and the like and so on. And again, automating parts of the business continuity process itself. From a cybersecurity perspective, a lot of these things are dealt with as part of cybersecurity programs, but I think BCM, cybersecurity, disaster recovery are certainly becoming much more closely aligned. So looking at things like security operations centers, log monitoring and so on from a scene perspective. So looking at logs of servers and so on to identify patterns and threats and vulnerabilities. Thinking about things like access and identity controls and encryption methodologies and so on. All very important as part of the overarching business continuity evolution as we move more and more into the digitally transformed space in which we all now work. Another evolutionary area of BCM is around the focus of resilience as opposed to the focus of building plans to respond to individuals or identified events. I mentioned previously about a lot of the traditional BC plans are really built around how do we respond to a particular event. I think the resilience focus is really much more strategic, looking at the operations of the organisation, looking at how we might pivot in the event of an incident or a disaster, about how we might take advantage of certain crises or incidents or disasters, and certainly a lot of organisations did that during the pandemic. Whilst business continuity traditionally around some of those older mechanisms like premises and so on are going to need to remain in place, I think there's going to be a much bigger push towards data resilience and cyber resilience. So again, what are the mechanisms by which we can continue our business functions and processes in the event that we have some sort of data or privacy breach or some sort of significant IT outage? So cyber resilience really becoming a discipline in its own right, in parallel to business continuity planning and business resilience itself. Another aspect of BCM evolution is around the permanent move to remote working models. First of all, there's a technology aspect to that in terms of the security, the availability and so on of those environments, the availability of equipment and the access to the necessary tools that people need. Secondly, there's a need for organisations to consider, are those workplaces fit for purpose? for those employees, because obviously organisations have a duty of care to their employees that are working in those environments. And of course, during COVID, informally, people would be, working from the kitchen bench top or kitchen table. But of course, as these models change to become more permanent, people have now got dedicated spaces. But again, organisations need to be thinking about what is our work from home strategy. And of course, thirdly, we now have dozens or hundreds of individual sites from which we're now operating. So again, historically, where organisations would have everybody coming to one single central building to work, the organisation now effectively has hundreds, or maybe in some cases thousands, of workplaces for which it needs to think about the business continuity strategy. So, for example, if a large number of employees live in a fire-prone area or a flood-prone area, there is potential for a lot of those employees to be impacted. If you've got a lot of employees living in a similar neighbourhood that's serviced by the same power grid or telecommunications grid, again, a lot of those people can be impacted. So we've still got to think about the business continuity requirements. We can't just ignore the fact that all these people are now working from multiple different sites, dispersed all over the place, whereas previously we only really need to think about, if we've got two premises, one premise goes down, we move to another one. If we've got hundreds or thousands of individual employees working all over the place, what is our business continuity strategy for all of those individual locations, and how do we make sure, again, from a continuity of operations perspective, that we have relevant strategies in place? And finally, from a communications, training and exercising and awareness perspective, BCM really needs to be extended to all corners of the organisation. And what I mean by that is, again, traditionally, BC plans were undertaken by a particular project group or level of middle management. A number of people participated in the BIAs, a number of people participated in the plan development, and then the annual testing, the awareness and training. Again, probably a small subset. Very rarely is BCP does it make it to the induction training, for example, for new employees. And of course, now in the way that we're working, everyone needs to be aware of business continuity, because it's part of everybody's normal working considerations. What if things go wrong? Whether I'm working from home, whether I'm working from the office, wherever I might be, how do we maintain business continuity? And therefore, the training and awareness around that for all staff is critically important. From a communications perspective, organisations need to think about incident and communications plans and bolster those, and make sure that they deal with the multiple different number of audiences that we need to communicate with, and the multiple locations and so on. And of course, training from a cyber awareness perspective, training from a BCP perspective, and involvement in all areas of the organisation in BC, DR and cyber incident response and resilience and continuity testing needs to occur. We need to be thinking more about building skills and capabilities across the organisation, more so than just building plans. And I think that's a really important differentiation, and where BCM needs to go. We really do need to think about upskilling the entire organisation to be prepared and to be able to respond, not just about the BC project. The resulting deliverable is just purely about defining a document, producing a document which we can refer to. We need to start making sure that we're building that whole culture of continuity and resilience across the entire organisation. So at the start of the webinar, I talked about the evolution of BCM up until today. And I talked a little bit about how the strategies which were previously developed over those 1950s, 60s, 70s and 80s were very much premises-based or location-based, where people were going to work all in one location, where all of the communications was initiated and made in and out of that one location, where data communications networks terminated and were central to that location, where IT data centers were on premise and everything was hosted from that one place. And of course, therefore, the strategies around BCP were, if there were an impact on that location or that facility, where would people go? How would we continue business? Of course, now in this post-pandemic digital era, we find ourselves faced with hundreds or thousands of individual sites. And so the strategies around BCP need to change to take into account a lot of that technology focus that we've implemented data and information protection and importance to the organisation. And so I think that the mindset needs to shift in terms of, when we're developing business continuity strategies, they are quite different to where we came from before. I think we need to think about building preparedness and skills and capabilities over plans. I think it's far more important to have capabilities within the organisation, with people thinking outside the square and outside the box about how to pivot and how to respond to different types of disasters and crises, as much as it is about having a formal document, which we call our business continuity plan. So I think the whole communications, training, exercising and awareness is evolving in terms of BCM, and it obviously needs to continue to evolve to make sure that it becomes part and parcel of every organisation. And all areas of the organisation now need to be involved in terms of the thought processes around business continuity management, because the types of event like the pandemic that we just had obviously impact every single person in the organisation. They don't just impact a subset. Before I take questions, just a reminder of a couple of courses which are relevant, or certifications which are relevant to this webinar today. DRI has the CBCP, Certified Business Continuity Professional, training and certification, and also recently revamped, redeveloped course Cyber Resilience, Certified Cyber Resilience Professional, CCRP. You can get full details of these from your local DRI website, or from the central DRI.org website, of course. And there are two versions of both courses available: 2-day courses and 4-day courses, plus the certification exam for anybody that's interested. So a few questions from attendees. Just got a little bit of time at the end here just for a few questions. First of all, what do we see as changes occurring in the regulatory standards and methodologies space? What sort of changes are we expecting to see there? I guess the regulatory bodies, the standards bodies and so on always look at major events such as the COVID-19, but any other major weather extremity or IT outage or cyber incident and so on. And they're always keen to obviously understand how organisations responded, where the key learnings were, what was effective, what wasn't, and therefore how do standards and regulatory requirements need to change. So I guess from a general perspective, there's no surprise there that those organisations are going to continue to look at those. I know that operational organisational resilience is becoming a big topic, and certainly in Australia here, the Australian Prudential Regulatory Authority in the banking and finance sector has released a operational resilience standard called CPS 230, and I believe the FFIEC and the UK authorities are doing something similar. I know that ISACA recently released a new audit program for business continuity and disaster recovery, taking into account some of the concepts that we talked about today. ISO has also released a new version of under the 22301 framework, 22332, best practices for developing plans. So rather than speak about any one of them individually, I think, as an industry, these standards are going to continue to evolve based on these types of incidents, and how organisations need to bolster their response and their resilience capabilities. Second question is, can I give some guidance around cloud disaster recovery and backup and recovery strategies and technologies? It's a big subject, it's a big topic. I guess as some general advice, first place to start looking is with your incumbent vendor. So if you're a Google Cloud hosted organization, or if you're an Amazon Cloud hosted organization, or you're a Microsoft Cloud, go to those vendors' websites and look at the options that they provide. That's the natural place to start. There's so many different technologies available. If you go to Amazon, I know they've got some great documentation around disaster recovery, data recovery, disaster recovery, backup, archiving, snapshotting. They've got a whole range, about 5 or 6 different sort of products, all around different sort of requirements. So the key thing is, looking at things like, infrastructure as code, so you can move workloads around very quickly, recovery of microservices strategies. There's a whole webinar in itself just around IT disaster recovery, but certainly from a perspective of looking at solutions, go to the vendor that you're hosting with, or the service provider that you're hosting with, and look at those solutions which are closest to home first. There are then a whole range of specific or industry developed solutions like, in the backup space, Veeam and Rubrik and those sorts of organizations. And then obviously different vendors in the recovery site. If you're looking for alternate site space, there's specific vendors in those. There are vendors offering mass notification tools and so on as well. So certainly from a DR perspective, there are a whole range of different options available. And yeah, the place to start is with your incumbent vendor, whoever you're hosting with, and then look, if you need to, more broadly afield to third-party solutions. Another question here is probably the final question for today is there any one software solution which we can implement to solve all of the topics we've talked about today? Unfortunately, there's not one that I know of. There are various different software products across different areas of business continuity. So there are tools to help with planning, and there are tools to help with testing, and there are tools to help with mass notification. There are tools to help, as I just spoke about, with technology recovery and so on. There is no one overarching tool that I know of. I would certainly love to know about one. There is no one tool that I know of specifically which solves all of those problems. I guess the key thing there is, make sure you understand what your requirements are from a tooling perspective. Make sure you look at what your needs are. Some of the tools are very complex and way more complex than you need, so you're paying for a lot of functionality that you don't need. Certainly, if anybody does discover one tool that will solve all these challenges that we talked about today, I'd love to hear about it. But in the meantime, it's probably a best of breed in different categories that you need to source. So that wraps up the webinar for today. Thank you everybody for attending. I hope it's been worthwhile. I'm very keen to continue the conversation with anybody that'd like to reach out. You'll find me at rod.crowder@dri-anz.org. You'll also find me on LinkedIn, just Rod Crowder, with all of my contact details there. So I really look forward to continuing the conversation with some of you. If you do have any specific ideas for similar webinars, please feel free to let me know or contact DRI directly. We're always keen to put on these types of informative events. So please let us know any topics you'd like us to cover in the future. And again, thanks very much, and stay safe, everybody. Thank you. Bye for now.